Okay, well, welcome back to your quarterly economic update from the Business Council with two of the province's most esteemed economists, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincic. So we're here to talk a little bit about what's happened in the Canadian and Albertan economy over the last quarter. So last time we spoke, we looked back on how 2023 shaped up in terms of growth and prosperity. So now that we're into Q2 of 2024, let's take a little look at what's happened over the last quarter, both in Alberta and nationally.
No, sounds good. And I think that one of the interesting things for us when we look at how the economy is going in Alberta nationally, I'm sure we'll kind of talk about this as we go along, but we've been expecting an economic slowdown for a while. We're seeing on a per capita basis a pretty weak performance across Canada. Alberta's doing a bit better than the national average, but we use the phrase the fastest skater in a slow team. And so we're still seeing positive growth, but it's all being fueled by population increases. And so we're seeing an overall softening. We're seeing jobs numbers not keeping up with population growth. We're seeing, kind of waiting to see when interest rates are going to end up falling. And so there's a lot of this kind of waiting and seeing kind of sense right now as we try to figure out whether or not we've turned the corner and can start seeing some interest rate relief and just kind of stumbling along in a way.
Stumbling along is a good way to put it, because there's a few paradoxes in this quarterly update. But let's start where we usually start with people and with jobs. So in this quarterly update, you mentioned that Alberta is seeing pretty strong employment growth. So is Canada, and it's due to two key factors. Can you walk us through what those are?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the areas where Alberta has really been a standout is in employment growth. So if we look over the past year, March to March, Alberta has seen 3.4% increase in jobs versus if you look elsewhere across Canada, it's only about 1.5%. So we really stand out here. And in particular, when you break this down a little further, it's not public sector jobs, it's private sector that's really driving these gains. 3.7% increase coming from the private sector, not the public sector, which is what we're seeing elsewhere. In other words, other provinces are seeing slowing gains in terms of jobs. Alberta is not. Now, a big driver of that, as Mike mentioned in his intro, is likely population growth, which is really the big thing at play. 4.4% increase in the population over the last year. That's pretty insane. Mm-hmm.
And I think, too, that this also kind of speaks, maybe I'll just counter all Alicia's positive statements with my negative ones.
Immediately.
One of the factors in terms of the Canadian economy kind of stumbling along is that whenever people talk about the fact that, no, we're still creating jobs across Canada and, things are going okay, the concerning fact is that it is largely public sector gains, as Lish said. And so you need
elsewhere across Canada.
Yeah, and you need private sector jobs in order to create the tax base and the revenue needed in order to be able to finance public sector jobs. And so just increasing the size of the public service and then looking at overall employment gains, rather, it's not necessarily indication of a healthy economy. And so Alberta not just leading the country in terms of job growth, but those actually being private sector job gains is a little ray of sunshine when it comes to the employment side of things.
Mike being a rare ray of sunshine.
Extremely rare.
Okay, but that brings us to kind of paradox number one. I think there's sort of two paradoxes in this update. So you've gone on about how strong the Alberta employment growth is and how it's notable and that it's private sector, but you say that the labor market is weakening at the same time.
Yeah, so basically what's happening, pairing those things together, is jobs growth is not quite matching that huge increase in population that we've seen, and we're starting to see an uptick in unemployment as a result. So there are more Albertans who are looking for work that are unable to find a job, and there are fewer job vacancies. So if you'll remember just a couple quarters ago, we were talking about how hard it was for businesses to find workers for the jobs that were open. That is less of a problem because those job vacancies have gone away.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you to sort of put this into every person kind of term. So there's this weird paradox that's going on in the economy. What does it actually feel like out there if you're a job seeker?
It feels like there aren't as many jobs available as there were, and there aren't as many businesses that are trying to staff up, and there aren't as many businesses that are going to staffing agencies to try to get them to find people to work for them. It's slowing from their perspective, and so there just isn't as much churn, there isn't as much activity going on.
Right. Harder to get a job.
Well, and then from the job seeker's perspective, it takes longer to have your application reviewed and to get an interview, and likely there might be more steps along the process, and so it can just be really frustrating in the time that it would take to actually get a job. I mean, I have seen this on TikTok. I don't know how many times people are like, the job market is the worst. These are all American creators, but it is really terrifying. Like, if you're a job seeker, oh my goodness, I can't imagine what that would feel like.
Yeah, I mean, In perspective, I mean, we've had low points in the economy before, and there have been much lower ones than this.
Oh, yeah.
But as a kid growing up in the early 1990s, trying to find work, people were pretty convinced at that point that there are no jobs available, period.
Right, and here we tick up to 6% unemployment, and we're crying Armageddon.
Yeah, it was 12% back then.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, though, that begins to kind of explain one of the paradoxes, like strong economy creating lots of jobs, but not creating as many jobs to make up for the amount the population is growing. So that might explain some of this strange feeling, and I think this will come up later when we talk about how households versus businesses are feeling, that like you can have a strong economy, probably the strongest in the country, which is fantastic news, but it doesn't necessarily feel that way, especially to your average job seeker.
No, for sure not. And the strongest economy in the country is, factually true, and it's easily demonstrated, but it's still not strong objectively. Alberta's economy is, like the rest of the country, is still not growing faster than the population is. So we have declining GDP per capita across the country, and Alberta's not in a very different position here. So it's not like things are absolutely amazing right now. They're just, like I said, fastest skater on a slow team.
Right.
Let's just parse this out a little bit regionally to dive into the details a bit. What are we seeing? Are there any regional differences in the Alberta labor market?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting finding of this snapshot as we look to see across regions. We talk so much about Alberta overall, forgetting that there's actually some pretty big differences within. And so a number of regions are seeing that overall unemployment increase like we would expect, but there are actually a few markets where the labor market is still tightening. And so I think this is going to be something where we're going to continue to watch over the course of the next couple of quarters to see, are they going to slow down like the rest of Alberta, or is there something different that's happening in those labor markets that means that there's going to be greater strength?
Is there anywhere that's particularly standing out to you? It's interesting you mentioned that we often talk about Alberta, but I had occasion a couple of years ago that I happened to do like a business roundtable in Fort McMurray, and then just a couple days later in Lethbridge, and I've always remembered since then that I'd always known sort of how big the province is and how different and diverse, but I mean those places are physically a long way apart and economically a long way apart. I mean, if you overlaid that on Europe, there's probably like 3 countries of space in between Fort McMurray and Lethbridge. So yeah, anything in particular that you're seeing that's interesting?
Yeah, a couple. So Red Deer, Camrose, Drumheller, and Rocky Mountains Northwest are the regions that have all actually seen a decrease in unemployment over the last year. So they're totally bucking the trend. Yeah,
go Red Deer. My hometown.
Go Red Deer.
Go Red Deer.
And also interesting is Calgary's unemployment rate actually has not increased. It's managed to stay the same, even though, likely we're seeing most of the population growth in Calgary, which is kind of interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, so the second, I guess, paradox that we found in this report is the businesses are feeling okay, but Albertans are not feeling okay. Talk a little bit more about how Albertans are feeling right now, because there's a pretty significant stat, some polling data that we have from our friend Jenna Brown, shows that Albertans who describe their financial situation as good has dropped from 54 to 42. That's heartbreaking.
Under half.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. So what are you seeing in terms of how Albertans are really feeling about the economy right now?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just add on one thing on that is that's the biggest uptick that we've seen in that survey since she started to do this polling data in, I think, 2021. So so pretty incredible and an important one to watch. But I think what we're seeing is really that even though we're seeing that job creation, we're seeing folks move to the province, which is good for businesses, individual Albertans really aren't that much better off. When you look at the wage growth that they've seen has been pretty limited, as we've talked about, plus inflation has actually remained quite high to the point where Albertans versus a year ago, they're not financially any better off. And a lot of folks, if you think about interest rates and having a lot of debt or a mortgage, they're actually worse off. And I think for a while we were seeing, people were making it work, and now they're having to make cuts. And we're seeing that show up in the retail spending data where people are per person or per household. They're, going to the cheaper store, switching to the store brand, putting off those luxury items, things like that to make it work.
Yeah, so last time we talked a little bit about how population growth was not necessarily contributing to increased consumer spending. And this one, retailers are not seeing the increase of population growth actually translate into increased sales because people are cutting back. They're cutting back on some of those purchases that aren't necessarily necessary.
So I had a question about this, if we can kind of parse the details. Alberta's population is increasing quite a bit, but we're not seeing retail spending increase. Is that on a per capita basis or on an absolute basis?
It's about flat on a total basis. And so we're seeing, basically what we're seeing is a whole bunch of new people coming into Alberta, making a home here. And obviously you need to spend money to live at the grocery store. hardware store, you're buying food, clothing, everything that you need, except that the number of people coming in is about equal to the growth that we're seeing in overall retail sales. And so what that means basically is that each individual person is spending less. And so it's almost like they're running to stand still from a retail perspective across the province.
Right. Let's talk about inflation, because we can't have an economic update without talking about inflation. Alicia, you said that inflation has remained very high, and I think the economist term is sticky. Is that right?
That is right. That is the very official economist term. I know it
that in the
sounds
glossary.
awful, but
Someone get me my econ degree. So yeah, this conversation hasn't gone away. What are you expecting from the Bank of Canada? There's some talk about maybe lowering interest rates. Maybe what is happening? What are you saying?
I'm not holding my breath for an immediate rate decrease. I think, you're right that everybody's looking to the Bank of Canada. They're looking to see. The narrative is effectively that there will be rate cuts at some point in 2024. It's just kind of a matter of when. And I think as of a month or two ago, and I'm sure some people even think now that we could see the first one of these rate cuts as early as June. I'm not sure, personally, I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I don't think we're seeing enough evidence of economic weakness and enough evidence of lower inflation. We talked about the inflation rate that Lish mentioned, the 3.5%. That's the Alberta rate specifically. It's lower in the rest of the country, but it's still not low enough and not comfortably enough within the bank's 1 to 3% band. They want it to be roughly in the middle of that before they start thinking about it, and it's not. And we're still kind of, like I said, stumbling along the economy, so to the point where we're not seeing easing in those price pressures. And then on top of that, I think another small factor that might be driving the delay for the Bank of Canada in thinking about it, or my assumed delay, is the impact of the federal budget too. And so, so we have a high spending budget, and the amount by which the federal government has increased spending for this year compared to what they thought they would spend this year in 2019, it's like $115 billion more spending.
Yeah.
And so that's a fair bit of money that's being injected in. And so I think that there's a little bit of a problem with monetary policy and fiscal policy working at cross purposes.
Right.
Potentially. It's not a major factor, but it's certainly one that it's one that needs to be considered.
Well, and the Bank of Canada has a relatively, I would say, small mandate. They really can singular mandate. It's just making
inflation in check. Yeah.
And so there's probably not I don't know, what are the tools in their toolbox that they could use to address some of these inflationary pressures outside of raising and lowering interest rates?
Quite limited. And I think the other consideration, we always talk about kind of when will we see rates decrease, but the bigger question, I think, is the magnitude, right? When are we going to actually be back to quote unquote normal, or are we going to get back to quote unquote normal? And that's a huge consideration when we think about housing prices, right? So
because maybe we are in a quote-unquote new normal where it may not get down to near zero rates that we had, but it may stay slightly elevated.
Well, and there's also the fact that those near zero rates, even though they were around for a while, that was the new normal at that time. Historically speaking, we just went through a period of some of the lowest interest rates that we've ever seen. And so that's not normal. And so how much, that's an excellent point about how much lower they're going to go and whether we'll see small rate decreases when they eventually come, or whether they'll be large. Right? I can't imagine they're going to be significant, but anything will help offer price relief for consumers for sure.
It is funny though, the rate that interest rates are at right now is probably pretty close to, if not maybe a little bit below, the actual long-term average, but we view this as sort of high interest rate environment. And I think you pointed out something very interesting, that I think we've hit a very complex point when it comes to interest rates, in that you can almost feel the tension in a few places. And one of them is with our federal budgets. I think you can feel that federal budgets are working at somewhat cross purposes to monetary policy, so fiscal and monetary policy. But I think we're also detecting, from the folks that we talk to, and even the way that this government talks, that the federal government's a little frustrated with the Bank of Canada as well, pursuing this very, very tight, in their view, monetary policy, and it's weighing down the Canadian economy. Mike's face says that he disagrees, so tell me why you disagree.
It's not that I disagree as much as that's sort of that's a politically motivated argument, and from the federal government's perspective, and so the Bank of Canada pursuing a 2% target inflation rate is not unreasonable, and it's not an aberration historically or internationally rather, and so it's
No, I was just going to add, I think from the Bank of Canada's perspective, what's keeping them up at night is, one, consumers' expectations for inflation, which have not normalized yet. So that's a major problem for them, as well as wage growth, which has continued to outpace productivity growth. That, in the Bank of Canada's eyes, is ultimately inflationary. So until they see all these things coming in check, they're not going to feel super comfortable.
And say just a little bit more on that bit. So consumers' expectations around inflation have not normalized. Talk like a regular human.
Yeah. So basically I know, regular economist human. So the Bank of Canada basically asks consumers, they have a survey for consumers and a consumer for businesses, and they essentially ask them, how much do you think prices are going to continue to increase, or how much are prices going to increase over the next year? There are different questions to kind of get at this. And basically what they're looking to see is for consumers to expect price increases of no more than what they want, which is about 2%, right? That normal average that we used to see. So anything above and beyond that makes them very uncomfortable.
And part of the reason for that is that inflation can be perpetuating.
Sure.
You know, if individuals are expecting inflation to be within, let's just say 4 or 5%, then they're going to adjust their spending patterns accordingly. They're going to make wage demands accordingly, and then that will help to create continued inflation in about that range. I wanted to actually pick up too on another point you mentioned earlier about we were talking about sort of historic interest rates and sort of where we are now compared to before. One of the other factors that, you know, even I can sit here all I want and say that interest rates have been higher before, and historically this is not unprecedented level, but at the same time, Canadians are struggling with high debt levels. You know, they've been rising over time, and the combination of that, the amount of money that people have in their mortgages, and so any increase in the interest rates or any sort of sustained higher than what they had expected previously level of interest is going to put a big dent in household finances, because you're spending a lot of your money on servicing the debt that you've got.
Right. Okay, so until now, I think we've actually probably leaned a little negative in this conversation, talking about how folks have been struggling and the difficulties that average Albertans and Canadians are dealing with, which I think is fair. Here's the second paradox, as Britt referenced earlier. Businesses aren't feeling that way. How are businesses feeling?
Overall, businesses are feeling optimistic, might be just a touch too positive, but they're feeling pretty okay, right? All things considered. So just kind of keeping in mind all the conversation that we've had about global economy, national economy, what's happened. I think the best thing that we're not seeing is a deterioration in terms of business expectations. So they still expect their revenues to continue. They still are going to hire more people, more Albertans. And when we look at the Chamber of Commerce has a business expectation survey that we compare across provinces, Alberta businesses are actually slightly more optimistic than elsewhere. So I think that's another good sign.
The upswing of Alberta businesses, like we were down and now we're the most optimistic. To see the increase in optimism among Alberta businesses is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So where are those businesses putting their capital?
One of the challenges that we had, there's not as much information on this kind of stuff as we would like to see in the past. Usually we disaggregate it in Alberta because the oil and gas sector makes up such a huge component of overall capital spending in the province. We usually look at, you know, what is it like in the oil and gas sector versus elsewhere, and it's pretty flat right now. So the expectations for 2024 capital spending are about the same as they were last year and about the same as they were before. Slight modest increase in oil and gas expenditures and a slight offsetting deterioration elsewhere. And so it's not a bad news story in the sense that, you know, it's harder to make that kind of capital spending in a high interest rate environment. But at the same time, one of the big challenges that we have across the country is Canada's flagging productivity levels. And so we've seen continual decline. And as the population increases, the amount of the capital stock, like the amount of tools and machinery and equipment and all the things that people need in order to be good at their jobs, we're underinvesting in those compared to the size of the the economy that we've got. And so I think that's another ongoing concern that we have. Alberta's holding steady, but we need to see more investment, more business capital spending, both in the province and across the country, in order to help turn this major challenge around. I mean, coming back to the wage growth, at the end of the day, like in a big picture sense, wages grow because productivity goes up. That is by far the most important factor. Nothing else is really close. And so in order to get that, it's not a direct one-to-one relationship with business capital spending, but it's a major driver. And so that's something that we're watching out for.
Well, especially as Canada's population continues to increase, it's even more and more important. I mean, this is an issue we're tackling with immigration as well.
One other bright light that shone to me was venture capital spending. So talk to us a little bit about that. Alberta's tech sector has been booming for, I think, several years now, but until this point, probably attracting a proportion of national venture capital spending that might be a little smaller than our sort of, quote, fair share. Where does it stand now?
For sure, yeah. Just going back 2 years, so in 2021, Alberta was only attracting about 4% of venture capital investment into Canada.
On a population base of, what are we, about 11% of the population?
Right, so well underrepresented.
Like a
yeah,
third maybe
exactly. Whereas moving forward to 2023, 11% of venture capital dollars came to Alberta. So even though elsewhere saw a huge decrease in venture capital, Alberta actually really held strong, and as a share of those dollars was able to really show its strength. So I think this is a really good news story for Alberta, who I think hasn't even really seen itself as a major player in this space.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, the only small sort of dark cloud I'd cast over that is that, like, kind of it's my job.
Your role.
That's why people love me at parties. Is that, you know, Alberta is strong and it's holding steady, as Lish said. The one challenge is that we're seeing pretty substantial declines over that same 2-year period elsewhere in the country. And so from a national perspective, Alberta is doing great, but I'm more concerned about what's happening in terms of venture capital spending outside of Alberta than inside.
In Canada overall. Yeah. Notwithstanding your wet blanket that you've thrown over it.
For everything.
Though, I really think something quite special is happening in the Alberta tech sector, and you can just kind of feel it with how people are even thinking about it and talking about it. You know, this feels like a mature tech ecosystem now. You know, there was a time, even only a few years ago, that Alberta felt a little bit like a B market in terms of tech, and you'd even hear people saying, oh, it's hard to make a, pure tech play work here. And now I think that, CEOs in Alberta, companies in Alberta really believe that this can be kind of an A market for tech, and these numbers sort of bear that out.
Right.
I want you to grab your crystal ball, your economist crystal ball, and pull it out.
Or my dartboard.
I prefer the magic 8 ball, maybe. Tell us what you think we're going to see for the rest of the year, because I think that's important when we're seeing these differing expectations, maybe between how individual households and businesses are seeing things. When we sit down at the end of the year for this podcast, what do you imagine we'll have seen in terms of the broad economic growth?
That's a really broad question. Can you narrow it down a little?
Economic growth.
I think that Alberta will do relatively well. I think we'll look back on the year and see that Alberta had the strongest economy in the country. One of the main drivers behind that is going to be expanded oil and gas production and the TMX pipeline coming online and starting to fill up now.
So that alone will lift GDP.
Yeah, that alone will. That the downside to that, of course, is that doesn't create a lot of jobs in the process, but it does help the company itself. It does help. It helps boost profit and therefore investment in the province, and it also helps the provincial government's bottom line. And so we're also seeing oil prices are currently tracking a bit higher than we had expected before. So that's also good news for the provincial government. So I think that we'll see. At the end of the year, we'll look back and say, yes, Alberta did perform better than the rest of the country. And the question will be, where do we sit in terms of interest rates, in terms of how household spending, satisfaction, and worry, and sort of consumer sentiment, where we sit there. I think that's going to be the big question mark for me.
Mm-hmm. I'll just wrap it up with, I think we'll continue to stumble forward. Yeah, I think it'll be a slow year, but I think we will continue to move forward. And I think next year we'll hopefully be having a much rosier, optimistic, limited wet blanket sort of conversation.
Hopefully.
Okay, lightning round. We do this every quarter, but we're switching it up just a tad for this one. So what are 3 words that you would use to describe the previous quarter?
Slow but strong.
That's pretty good.
3 words to describe what your expectations for the upcoming quarter.
Mine, unfortunately, are wait and see. I think there's a lot of waiting and seeing going on. We're going to wait and see whether the Bank of Canada holds firm on interest rates, whether they're going to decrease. Wait and see in terms of, the federal government. One of the things we didn't talk about much is in the last couple of months, the federal government has taken a number of steps to curb the number of non-permanent residents coming into the country, whether it's international students or temporary foreign workers. That's expected to have an impact on population growth in the country, but we don't know what that looks like yet. So that's another factor to consider. And then also looking to see whether or not there's any action or relief on the housing price front. Because I think that's another thing to look out for, is whether or not we're actually going to see the housing build out that everybody's hoping we're going to see to help drive prices down. A lot of the policies that have been put in place are good ones, but they're not necessarily going to have an immediate impact. And there's fair questions about whether they will have anything close to the government's expected impact at all. And so I think, which is obviously neither 3 words nor describing the upcoming quarter, but here we are.
I was going to say that's about 197 words more. Just something that you're looking forward to seeing.
I'm looking forward to seeing what I think will be an end of the paradox that we've been talking about thus far, where, businesses have been kind of okay because of population growth, but we haven't seen that translate to consumers. So end of the paradox.
I'm looking forward to seeing less anger, I guess, and frustration. I think that justifiably, there's a lot of frustration out there, speaking of, what you kind of see and feel. And, frustration, resentment, there's a lot of kind of negative energy out there, which is a highly technical economics term.
The negative energy index.
And I'm kind of looking/hoping to see a little moderation there, and perhaps a little sort of calm and return to more optimism.
Right.
I'll even jump in and halfway answer that, because I can see that happening potentially as well. And I would point to interest rates as one of the things that I'm sort of looking at. I don't think an interest rate cut is guaranteed, but I can feel that there is a certain amount of sort of pent-up demand sitting back based on the assumption that there's going to be an interest rate cut. And I think that is leading to some of the negative energy that you're sort of seeing. And I think any sort of cut, even a small one, may actually begin to sort of improve our economic energy index.
Yeah, I mean, people are very sensitive to anything that increases the prices, so we're seeing a lot of resistance to the carbon tax, for example, or carbon pricing. I mean, there may be a rebate that offsets the value of it for most Canadians, but, if you drive past a gas station and see prices going up, that's going to make you angry, and combine that with what things look like in grocery stores and everything else, and then how fast your paycheck is growing. I mean, there's a lot of justifiable reason for frustration.
Right. Well, I think that's where we will leave it. Mike, Alicia, thanks so much for joining us once again to talk about Alberta's economy and Canada's economy. The Alberta Snapshot Spring 2024 edition is available on our website for your interest.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Always a fun time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.